The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. Something about those lines of this poem by Robert Frost has always resonated with me. I have always found forests to be a welcoming haven, the tree line beckoning me to enter and explore the beauty and peace that lay within. Whenever I felt overwhelmed or stressed, I would go hiking in a nearby forest and feel completely calmed and rejuvenated within minutes. I always felt safe as long as the sun was shining. However, if I stayed too long and darkness would begin to fall, the forest would transform. That feeling of peace would turn to fear. I would feel as if a million eyes were on me, only I couldn't see them. The idea of the woods being lovely, dark, and deep is one I understand, but is overshadowed by a sense of danger. Perhaps this is an instinct left within us from generations past, telling us to fear to protect ourselves from predators. But whether day or night, I've never felt alone in a forest. The sounds of birds, the scurrying of rabbits or mice, and the giant trees moving in the breeze have always felt like kind companions to me. In folklore, forests are always a place of mystery and magic. Trees themselves are quite remarkable. They have intricate systems of roots that allow them to communicate with each other and keep the forest thriving, sharing nutrients to other trees and plants, and even sustaining cut down tree stumps for hundreds of years. I heard of a study recently that says that trees are actually sentient, meaning they're aware. They can hear you when you speak, they can see you, which reminds me of how people say you're supposed to speak to your houseplants to make them healthy. There is so much about them we are only now learning. It makes me wonder what else we don't know, or better yet, what we once knew and have forgotten. Today, I'm going to share a few stories of actual encounters with tree and nature spirits. The first is from a woman who claims to have the second sight. Mrs. B. Leeson from Worcestershire wrote, "One day, in the fall of 1949, my husband and I stood beside a holly tree in our garden. We discussed whether or not we should cut it down. It was growing too large and we worried about its roots disrupting our patio. We decided to cut it down the following day. Now, I'm an early riser, so just like every morning, I awoke the next day very early, and as I did, I noticed a small, pale green figure standing beside my bed. It stood very close. Surprised, I said, 'Who are you?' The figure replied with the softest breath, 'Holly.' Then the small figure faded away until I could no longer see it. I told my husband at breakfast later on. He replied, 'Well, that settles it. We can't kill the only fairy you've ever seen.' So the holly tree remained, and we organized the garden around it." There are many cultures that believe that trees and plants and nature in general all have their own spirit, and on occasion make themselves known to people. In the past, people looked to trees for protection. Upon entering a forest, they would knock on a tree trunk 3 times to awaken these spirits, to ask for protection or assistance if they had become lost in the woods. This is where the phrase knock on wood comes from. In 1938, Mrs. Vera Westmoreland's family bought a house with a lovely old garden, and near the back of the garden stood a very tall tree. Her father had planned to cut it down. Vera and her mother watched her father from the window in the house. He grabbed a saw and walked towards the tree. He paused as if he had run into something and rubbed his chest, looking confused. He went forward a second time, again, abruptly stopping, rubbing his chest, and moving slightly backwards. On his third attempt, he fell over violently, landing on his back. He got up and rushed back inside looking worried and pale. He said, something pushed him on his chest. Curious, Vera and her mother went out to the garden with her father. As they neared the tree, her father was once again knocked to the ground. They heard a deep voice say, "You cannot do that to my tree." And then they saw a brown and wizened face that they described as an elf. The father would have nothing more to do with the tree after that, and it became Vera's job to collect its fruit. She would see the elf from time to time and described him as a miniature old man. In 1939, when the war started, arrangements were made to dig an air raid shelter near the back of their garden. The men who tried to cut down the tree were met with the same hostility as Vera's father. They kept being shoved and knocked down by an invisible entity. Frightened, they dug the shelter farther down, and during the air raids, Vera would see the wrinkled old elf grin from time to time. Dryads are well known in Greek mythology as protectors of the forest and the trees they inhabit. Their life force was directly connected to that particular tree. They are usually associated with oak trees and are shy around humans. The last story sounded very much like a dryad to me, despite the description of the miniature wrinkled old man, as they are usually depicted as female and beautiful and tall. The next story is a woman's encounter with what she believed to be a dryad. It was a beautifully warm, sunny day, a lazy day, with that soft warmth that one only gets in Ireland. My hostess and my husband had wandered off and left me to my own devices. I strolled up through the park towards the lodge gates to a place where there was a broad stretch of greenwood beside the drive, and seated myself under the shadow of a huge beech tree. I sat for a while, enjoying the lovely scene before me and allowing the peace and beauty of it all to steal into my soul. All was still. Even the birdsong was hushed, and the silence was tense with an air of expectation, when there appeared beside me, under the great tree, a very tall figure, at least 10 or 12 feet high. It was a female figure dressed in green, flowing drapery, which, although there was no wind at all, seemed to wave and flutter in a breeze. The hair, which was a lustrous metallic green, was long and flowing free. The skin of the face was very pale, but luminous, and hard to describe. The features were fine and delicate, high cheekbones, full lips. Her hands and arms were stretched sideways, and her face was uplifted to the sky. The outstanding impression I received was of her tremendous vitality. She was absolutely vibrant with life, and she seemed to be radiating this life and energy into the world and nature around her. She was visible for 4 or 5 minutes, and then gradually faded from my sight. Mrs. Gall told me that, without her knowing how, this glorious creature had made her aware that she was the spirit of the great beech tree. And she said that for the rest of the day, she carried with her a feeling of elation and exaltation, such as she had never experienced before. These encounters seem fascinating and quite enchanting. However, not all forest encounters are harmless. For example, the Black Forest in Germany is said to be one of the most haunted places in the world and is also the setting of the fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm. There are stories, whether they are true or not, of the tall man occupying these woods. The tall man is said to be very frightening, with white eyes and multiple arms, who chases children who wander into the forest intending to kill them or send them home to confess any bad deeds to their parents. This sounds like many tales I have mentioned in previous episodes of stories used to scare children into good behavior. The Black Forest has many legends of monsters, spirits, demons, werewolves, and witches. There are tales of hikers going missing, but with a forest that large, that kind of makes sense. Another forest surrounded in mystery is the Hoia Baciu forest in Romania. It is compared to the Bermuda Triangle. Strange disappearances have occurred, such as a shepherd and a flock of 200 sheep vanishing. Or, on another occasion, a 5-year-old girl disappeared, only to emerge from the forest 5 years later without having aged or changed a day. The last story I will share today talks about the wee folk, as they were once called. There are so many stories and encounters of people seeing these tiny beings over the centuries, always near forests or fields, and always described very similar. Brown skin, tattered clothing, usually the color of the nature around them, like green or brown. Many of these encounters were had by people who never believed in such things, but cannot deny what they experienced. In 1955, Mrs. Beverly C. Mulligan went for a picnic with her husband on a hill above Loch Duick. She was originally from Australia and her husband was Scottish. Around 2 p.m., they were lying quietly in the sun on the grass surrounded by heather and bracken. Beverly noticed movement at the corner of the clearing. She quietly and gently got her husband's attention, motioning to the 2 small figures that had emerged from the bracken. They were crossing the open space towards another patch of bracken. They were dressed in green breeches and short coats the shade of heather. They had no hats, and one had darker skin than the other, both a shade of brown. One was around 10 inches high and the other perhaps 8 inches. They were small human-like bodies or beings. They were carrying a bundle that seemed heavy, but they made no sound whatsoever. Beverly and her husband were shocked and couldn't believe their eyes. They got up and tried to quietly as to not scare them. They followed them through the bracken to a hazel thicket a few yards away, only to lose them in the thicket. She stated afterwards that it seemed quite clear that when folklore the world over is so full of fairy beliefs, there must be some factual foundation of it all. In fact, Beverly's 92-year-old grandmother from Queensland used to tell her stories about tiny brown people in scanty clothes who she had seen by the river collecting water and at other times dancing. Beverly had never believed her grandmother's stories until this encounter. And to this day, her and her husband look back on it with astonishment. There is no greater peace than walking through a lush green forest surrounded by the beauty and seeing the warm sun peeking through the protective canopy of the trees. But be aware, you are not alone. The trees are watching you, and you are among the many inhabitants of the woods, whether they be spirit or physical, whether you see them or simply sense they are there. So come prepared and show respect, because you are entering their world. Thank you for joining me, everyone. The stories I got today are from a wonderful book called Seeing Fairies by Marjorie T. Johnson from the Lost Archives of the Fairy Investigation Society, Authentic Reports of Fairies in Modern Times. I changed the words a little bit to make it easier to read, but that is where I got those stories. If you like those stories, I suggest buying the book because there are so many reported encounters in there, and most of them have to do with the little wee folk that I mentioned in that last story. So thank you so much again for joining me, everyone. I apologize for taking so long to post, and I promise to post more often now. This has been Selena with Tales of Fae and Folklore.